Now, we put this webinar together really because many of us, most of us, probably actually all of us are having to deal with change. Now, realistically, I could have probably said that particular sentence any time, I guess, in the last 200 years or so. But the last few years, I think, do feel rather different because the pace of change is increasing and the nature of that change is changing in itself as it goes. We do live in volatile, uncertain times. I think it can be difficult to keep up. For some of us even, change can be overwhelming. Probably even more so because of all the COVID-related issues we've had to deal with over the last 2 years. Now, some of you may have heard the acronym VUCA used to describe this. In the current environment, I think things are volatile. Things are volatile. Things are changing quickly and often in rather unexpected ways. They're uncertain. We don't really know what's going to happen. They're complex. There are lots of moving parts and everything affects everything else. And they're ambiguous. We're facing new, unclear, and ambiguous situations. And for many of us, working life has become a little bit more volatile, a little bit more uncertain, more complex, more ambiguous over the last 2 years, really since the advent of COVID. So we're going to go through one example. It's going to be based on some real data from just over 100,000 people who completed the American English version of the MBTI assessment at some point between January 2020, just before the pandemic started, and September last year. Now, when people complete the MBTI, really for research purposes, we ask them for some background information, and that includes the percentage of their time that they spend working at home, or otherwise working remotely. And we're going to look at that data month by month in the time frame you can see in the chart. So first of all, let's look at the people who spent 90% or more of their time working remotely. So if no one was spending all or most of their time remotely, the line on that chart would be down at 0. If 2/3 of people spent all or almost all their time working remotely, the line would be right at the top of the chart. Okay, here's the data. So if we look at January 2020, for example, only 6% of those who completed the assessment in that month spent 90% or more of their time working remotely. But you can see the graph starting to climb from March and April as COVID hit. More and more people were working remotely till by March last year, that had risen to 38%. And now the percentage is declining again as hybrid working becomes more common and other people are moving back to the office. And of course, if you look at the other end of the scale, at people who spend none or very little of their time working remotely, it's the opposite picture. Before COVID, almost 2/3 of that group never or very rarely worked from home. By summer 2021, that number had halved, and now though is creeping up again. So it's all very well looking at these big groups of people, but let's see how this relates to you. I've just launched a poll asking how much you work remotely. So if you'd like to read through those options there and say to what extent you work remotely. Do you always work from home? Do you mostly work from home? It's about half and half, mostly in an office or always working in an office. So let me give you just a few more moments to answer that poll. And I think 3/4 of you voted. Let's see if we get up to nearly all of you. Okay, creeping up to 80%. Let's close our poll in just a moment. Okay, closing a poll now. And let me share the results with you. So what you can see, there's actually quite a spread. Rather more of you are working from home. They're just over a third always working from home, a quarter mostly working from home, down to actually 14% of you always working in office over or of a formal workplace. Okay, and let me just take those results away again so you can see the rest of the slides. Now, of course, many of those people on our slide who are always working from home may not have wanted to do that. And for the third of you who were always working from home, it may not be that that's your ideal either. So here's a question for you to think about, not a poll, nothing for you to fill in, just something to think about. What's your preference when it comes to remote working? So think about how much you actually work remotely and how much you would prefer to work remotely. Would you rather work remotely more than you do now, or less than you do now, or neither? Are you pretty much where you want to be? Now what we're going to do now is look at some early data from a survey we're actually running at the moment. And actually, if you want to take part in this research, it'll only take you 10 minutes, and we'll give you a link to complete that survey yourself later. And please feel free to share that link with co-workers or friends. So we asked people, what would be your ideal? What percentage of the time, ideally, would you like to spend working remotely or at home? And along the bottom of this chart, you're going to see the different answers people could give. Do they want to spend none of their time working remotely? Up to 10% of their time working remotely, and so on. And the scale at the left-hand side shows what percentage of the total will be in each group. This is what we found. Just 4% said that their ideal was to spend none of their time working remotely, always in the office. 35% spend less than half their time working remotely. Almost half, 49%, to spend more than half their time working remotely. And 13% said they would spend, ideally, all their time working remotely. So that was their preference. But we also asked them what they actually did. How much of their time did they actually spend working remotely? And this is what we found. More than twice as many people were working entirely in the office than wanted to, 10% compared with 4% at the left-hand side there. Twice as many people were working entirely remotely than wanted to, 27% compared with 13% at the right-hand side, with less people working in those middle categories in a more hybrid way than wanted to. In fact, across all the data, 44% were working remotely more than their preference, a third, 34%, work remotely less than their preference, and just less than a quarter, only 23%, work remotely at a level that matched their preference. And if you look at the people who either worked at home all the time or worked in the office all the time, an even bigger mismatch. 73% of those who never work remotely would like to do so any some of the time, and 70% of those who always work remotely prefer not to do that all the time. So we live in stressful times, and issues around hybrid working or working from home are important and maybe a stressor for you, but clearly there are many other stressors around as well. And we know that stress has increased over the last year. Stress is increasing in the United States workforce, for example. So in 2021, the American Psychological Association carried out a survey of over 1,500 full-time workers, and more than 3/4 of those had experienced work-related stress in the month before they took the survey, and that's up from what the APA found in previous years. And for most of those people, that stress definitely had a negative impact. Not just on them as individuals, but on their ability to do the job. So this stress was obviously not a good place for them, but also ultimately affected the bottom line for the organizations that they worked for. And that data isn't surprising, because we know that stress affects performance. We all need a degree of stimulation or stress in order to perform at our best. With no stimulation, we're essentially asleep. As stimulation or stress increases, we become more and more alert until we reach our peak level of performance. But if stress continues beyond that point, we become more and more anxious in a zone of everyday stress. And realistically, that's where many workers are for much of the time. And if stress increases further, under extreme stress, we get to a state of collapse and burnout. Now, most of us, and most of the people we work with, hopefully won't get to that final stage. But lots of us, perhaps most of us even, are likely to be in an orange zone of everyday stress. We aren't performing as well as we could do. If we don't do anything about it, there's a danger that we're dragged into a downward spiral. So it's really important to understand what things stress us out, what the impacts of our stress on us are, and how we can pull ourselves out of that downward spiral. And this is where it's important to start thinking about personality. Because your stress triggers, your stress reactions, the way you can pull yourself or others back from a stage of collapse, all of these relate to your individual personality type, or their personality type if you work with other people. And we're going to look at this using the MBTI framework, the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So before we do that, let's just have a look to see how familiar you are with the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So again, I'm launching even another poll. And you can see there are options there. Are you an MBTI practitioner who uses it often? Are you someone who's received MBTI feedback but not a practitioner? You've heard of the MBTI? Or you're saying, what is the MBTI? Again, let me just give you a little while to work through that poll. Okay. So I think nearly 3/4 of you have voted. Just give you a little while longer. Okay, let's get up to 80%. Okay, poll's closing in just a moment. And let's close the poll now and share those results. So I think half of you are MBTI practitioners already. Just under a third of this MBTI feedback. The rest of you perhaps have either not heard of the MBTI, but aren't really very familiar with it. So I'm aware that half of you are MBTI practitioners. What I am going to do is to just spend a moment just to go through the areas that the MBTI covers to describe the MBTI framework. So please, for those who are practitioners, do bear with me while I do that. So the MBTI framework looks at 4 areas of personality. It looks first of all at what's called extraversion introversion, where we get our energy from, where we focus our attention. Do we focus our attention and get our energy from the outside world of people and things? In which case we'd say you had preferences for extraversion, or do we focus our attention on our inner world of thoughts and feelings and get our energy from there? In which case we'd say you have preferences for introversion. So we have preferences for one or the other, extraversion, introversion, just as most of us have a preference for either right with our right hand or left hand. We can go to the other side, we can do extraversion or introversion, even if we're on the other side. But we have a preference for one of those, find them more energizing and spend more time there if we possibly can. The second area is sensing or intuition. What sort of information do you prefer and trust? If we prefer sensing, we prefer information which is real, which is actual, which is solid, which is based on the evidence of our 5 senses, hence the word sensing. If we prefer intuition, we prefer and we trust information which is about how things connect together, what the possibilities are, what could be, where things are heading for the future. Thinking and feeling looks at the way we prefer to make decisions. If we prefer to make decisions on the basis of objective logic, we say we have preferences for thinking. If we prefer to make decisions on the basis of our values and how people will be affected by those decisions, we say we have preferences for feeling. Of course, in the real world, we may not always be able to make decisions the way we prefer to do so, but it's about our underlying preference. And last but not least, judging and perceiving looks at the way we like to live our lives, our lifestyle, how we deal with the world around us. If we have preference for judging, we like to live our lives in an organized, structured, planned way. If we have preferences for perceiving, we like to live our lives in a more open-ended, spontaneous, unplanned way. Now, depending on our preferences, different things will stress us out. We'll have different stress triggers. We'll have different stressors. So let's look at extraversion introversion, for example. In normal times, people who have a preference for extraversion are going to find it stressful if they have to spend too much time alone. Introverts, if they can't get any time alone. Extroverts, if there's not enough external stimulation going on. Introverts, if there's too much going on and they find that distracting. These are some of the things that each type might find stressful in these times of change, and especially in these times when many of us are looking at remote or hybrid working. People have preferred extroversion by just not having those people around. Whether it's the buzz in the office or whether it's their family around them, just not having that around them, especially if they're working from home, not enough energy, not enough stimulation, not enough buzz from that home environment. And even if they've gone back to working in the office, many offices are quite quiet places at the moment. Not being able to socialize, not being able to travel, not being able to do those things that are connected to the external world that we used to be able to do. And the people with a preference for introversion, some of people with an introversion preference, and I have an introversion preference myself, actually found working from home not too uncongenial. I actually quite like some parts of it. But there may be concerns about having to return to an office. Perhaps people quite enjoy the peace and quiet of working from home. We have some evidence to suggest that's the case. May not be looking forward to going back to the office, especially if they have to do it full time. Find a noisy environment stressful, whether that's the office or perhaps a noisy environment at home. Too many online meetings. Too many online meetings are stressful for everybody, but may be particularly stressful for those with an introversion preference. And actually the expectation of not needing any contact. Some people might expect people with introversion preference not to need any contact with people at all, and that can result in people going away to their cave and just not having any contact with the outside world, which in assess is stressful. We did carry out a research survey in the first 6 months of lockdown and remote working back in 2020, and these are some of the results that we found. Introverts were significantly more likely than extroverts to say that they were enjoying a peace and quiet and working from home, and also at risk of giving them the space and time to reflect and take stock. Extroverts were more likely than introverts to say that they missed having people around, that things were just too quiet. Now, one question that we find we're being asked at the moment at the Myers-Briggs Company is, will going back to the office put introverts at a disadvantage? The answer is, not necessarily. And I know that's a little bit of a politician's answer, but here's some concrete suggestions to make sure that perhaps that doesn't happen. So first of all, in both face-to-face and remote meetings, do allow time for thinking. If you yourself have introversion preferences, allow yourself time to think before answering. And if you're an extrovert, don't expect the best introvert answer straight away. Introverts want time to think things through and give you the best answer. If you ask a question to a group and don't get an immediate answer, pause and wait. And in a virtual meeting, you may just need to remind some participants to remain quiet while you listen to what someone else has to say. And when an introvert does say something, when they do make a suggestion, do take the time to listen to them. As I've also mentioned, introverts tend to think things through before speaking, so there may be actually a lot behind what they're saying. Brushing the idea aside and avoiding taking too seriously is a good way to demotivate them. And do try not to interrupt. You will find that introverts may pause while they're thinking things through, so let them finish rather than jumping in. Also, do think about how you communicate, your mode of communication. Many people with introversion preference will appreciate having information written down. Others may find one-to-one meetings useful, but large group sessions, whether face-to-face or virtual, are unlikely to work well. Plunging everybody back in the office in a big group and expect everyone to contribute immediately may not be the best option. Remember that our natural tendency will be to communicate to others in a way that works for us, ourselves, and this may not be what our audience or individual team members need. Do allow introverts some time alone, quietly, to recharge their batteries. This may seem like wasted time, but it really isn't. To keep energized and productive, people with introversion preference are likely to need some me time before they can re-engage with what's going on. In a traditional office, ensure there are quiet spaces. And for remote workers, as I've already mentioned, remember that having virtual meeting after virtual meeting without a break, that can be hard on anyone, but tends to be particularly hard on introverts who don't have that time to refresh and recuperate in between. And don't enforce socializing. Don't imagine that when you do go back to the office, everyone suddenly is going to want to socialize with each other. Don't go from 0 to 100 miles an hour when it comes to socializing when you get back to the office. Let's look at the next area, sensing and intuition. This is all about the sort of information that you trust. As we've already mentioned, people with preference for sensing trust information which is solid based on their 5 senses. Intuition, information which is about connections and possibilities. And that means that typically people with a sensing preference really don't like ambiguity. They want clear instructions and clear directions and don't like ideas that don't seem to be founded in reality or have any real purpose. Where on the intuition side, these people will be stressed if they're tied down to really exact instructions, or they have to go through lots and lots of detail when they're explaining things to people. You can see this playing out between people sometimes when they're asking each other for directions to get to somewhere, and that doesn't necessarily work in a way that the recipient wants to. In the current time, people with a preference for sensing may be stressed by ambiguities about whether or not they can work from home. What are the rules? Can I work from home? Do I have to work in the office? Exactly what are the rules? What are the conditions? I want clear instructions and clarity around this. For those of you working in organizations which have downsized, there may be a lack of role clarity for people who are in work, and that will be stressful for people with a sensing preference. And the virtual meetings in particular, if they're unstructured, if they're content-free, that can really seem like a waste of time and a stress to people with a sensing preference. Pardon me. On the intuition side, we don't want too many detailed rules and instructions. Some people with an intuitive preference who are coming up with new ideas may have found remote working difficult because the channels of communication just aren't as good as when you're working face-to-face, especially if they also have an extraversion preference. And may be concerned if they're going back to the office, they're just going back to the same old, because surely the old rules really don't apply in this new world of ours, and maybe a little bit stressed and concerned about what's going to happen in the future, because they're often quite future focused. Thinking and feeling looks at the way we think to make decisions on the basis of objective logic for thinking, or on the values and how people will be affected for feeling. People with a thinking preference will be stressed by decisions which may seem illogical and subjective, which they then feel are unfair, especially if those are organization-wide. And be find it stressful if they have to think too much about people rather than task, and have to spend too much of energy trying to support other people, as may well have been the case during the first part of lockdown, as may well be the case if organizations are moving back to the office. Whereas those people who have a feeling preference are going to be stressed when things don't feel fair, their values aren't respected, things seem contrary to their values, and where there's conflict and lack of harmony. So in the current moment, by logical decisions, by people who don't seem to follow what's being said, and by having to support others, as we've talked about. And on the feeling side, by not having people around to support them, by worrying about how others will be impacted, and we look at an example of that at the moment, and by spending so much time doing that, that they're not taking care of their own needs and become debilitated and stressed as a result. So here's an example of how that concern for others in these changing times can lead to stress. In the 2020 research, we asked the question, you can see on your screen, I feel guilty but I still have a job when others have been laid off or furloughed, and we asked people the extent to which they agreed or disagreed with that statement. You might want to think about how you would answer that question yourself. These are the responses that we got from everybody across the whole survey. So in total, 31%, just less than a third, agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. But let's look at the responses of those with a thinking preference and those with a feeling preference separately. Now, if you look at the blue columns, only 21% of those with a thinking preference agreed or strongly agreed, but 43% of those with a feeling preference. These people, the people with a feeling preference, were much more likely to feel this survivor guilt about still having a job. And there's several reasons why this personality difference is pretty important. First of all, if you look at the data, managers, and especially higher level executives, are far more likely to have a thinking than a feeling personality preference, and so they may well be less prone to survivor guilt themselves, take it less seriously. May, for example, find that they are congratulating people on still having a job. And that's likely just to add to any guilty feelings that are around. And this all adds to stress, because in our research, we found that those experiencing survivor guilt were also more likely to be that they were worried about their co-workers, they were more anxious in general, they were finding it more difficult to concentrate, and finding it more difficult to remain focused. And obviously those last two issues are things that could affect performance. So this isn't just about being nice to people, it's about performance and the bottom line as well. Judging and perceiving is about whether you like to live your life in a more structured, organized way or in a more open and spontaneous way. So people with a judging preference tend to be stressed by disorganization, whether it's disorganized people, disorganized organizations. So in this time of change, you really want to know that things are organized and structured and you know what's going on. And get particularly stressed typically by having to do things at the last minute. Whereas on the perceiving side, they don't like things to be inflexible, so too much structure is stressful. And tying things down to a decision before it needs to be done is stressful. And actually often these people really quite enjoy, get a real buzz from having to do things at the last minute. It may say, I do my best work at the last minute. So in these times, judging people will be stressed by unexpected changes in routine. And we very much saw that when people suddenly had to start working from home at the start of the pandemic. I think we may see it again if organizations aren't structured and careful in how they manage a return to work process. They do like to keep work at home separate, so working at home can be stressful. Don't like it when virtual workers are too flexible, so some of those perceiving people taking advantage of the flexibility to do things in odd hours, and when people don't follow the rules. On the perceiving side, if they're going back to the office, does that mean a return to rules? Does that mean they can't be as flexible as they want to be? Does that mean the kind of variety and spontaneity that they got used to? Can it be playful and lighthearted with colleagues, or things the way they used to be? And if they're going back to use the same processes that used to apply, we're in a new world though. Surely why are we doing this stuff? Why are we doing the same things in the way we always do? Now, many organizations have traditionally been set up in ways that actually appeal more to people with a judging preference. Organized, structured, a clear break between work and home and so on. But the data from our survey suggested that in the initial stages of the pandemic, some of these factors, like you see on the left, were really affecting judging people and making it more stressed than perceiving people. So we asked people how much they agreed with that statement, work is stressful, and compared results of people with perceiving preference with results of people with judging preference. And this is what we found. If you count up the numbers, almost 2/3 of those with judging preference agreed or strongly agreed, but only 47%, a little less than half, of those with perceiving preference. So those judging people did find work more stressful, certainly at that point in time, than people with perceiving preference. Now, many of these work stresses relate to change, especially sudden change. And the way we react to change depends on, amongst other things, our personality. When I say personality, I'm talking about our whole personality, because we're not just extrovert or introvert, and sensing or intuition, and thinking or feeling, and judging and perceiving as 4 separate scales. Those 4 preferences combine together dynamically to say something more about the whole person. So, for example, if someone has preferences for introversion, intuition, thinking, and perceiving, we say they had preferences for INTP, the objective analyst. So let's look at how our personality might affect how generally we react to change. Now, in a moment, I'm going to launch a poll question, but let me talk through the options first. You'll be asked to pick one of 4 options. You should choose the first option, keep the status quo, if you're someone who wants to keep things as they always have been, unless there's a really good reason for changing things, a really solid reason for change. Choose the second option if you're someone who does need a good reason for changing things, but once you're convinced, you just want to organize it and get it done now. Choose a third option if you're someone who likes the idea of change, but want to think it through first, and maybe get annoyed when people start changing things without thinking through all the complications and all the ramifications. And choose the last option if you really like change, especially if you're the one driving it, and maybe you want to do things differently, perhaps, just because you can. So think about which of those options might suit you best, and let me launch our poll now and see what your answers to that poll are. So your answers are coming in. So a little over half of you voted. Let's give you a little longer. Okay. Let me see if we get to 3/4 of you. Okay, nearly 80%. Let's close the poll now. And let me share those results. So you can see that 3% of you would look to keep the status quo if at all possible. 26% need to be convinced that change is a good thing, but once you're convinced, you just want to make things happen. 63% of you are that change is good, but really needs thinking through first, and 8% changes are just a good thing. Okay, let me just take those results away for now. Now, the reason I've shown you those options is that they typically relate to personality. Because people who chose the first option, keep the status quo, typically have personality preferences in the top left quadrant. The first 2 letters of their type formula are I and S, introversion and sensing. Those who chose the second, E and S, extraversion and sensing. The third, I and N, introversion and intuition. And the fourth, E and N, extraversion, intuition. And those don't always type exactly with your type because your circumstances, what's happening for you at the moment will affect that. But generally speaking, we tend to find those differences. And these differences explain some of the conflict you often get in a time of change. So, for example, people at the bottom right, who, by the way, are somewhat overrepresented in the top level of most organizations, these people may have a great new idea, a vision for the future, and ask the people at the top left to implement it. And by the way, those people at the top left, there's not many in you as a group, these people are typically overrepresented amongst line employees who cynics might say are doing the actual work in organizations. But those people don't necessarily get clear and detailed reasons for the change, because that's not what the people at the bottom right are about. So they ask those clear and detailed reasons. But the people at the bottom right might hear this, even though it's not necessarily meant that way, as we don't like change and we're resistant to change. So they tend to just to perhaps tell the people on the top left to go with the vision and get on with it. But the top left people still don't know exactly why the change is happening or how we're supposed to implement it, and so it goes backwards and forwards like a rather dysfunctional tennis match. But if people understand their personality preferences, and even better, understand where other people are coming from given their personality preferences, it can make change a whole lot smoother. Now, I haven't talked about how the top right and bottom left sometimes conflict with each other. Perhaps given time, I'll leave that to you to think about. So let's recap. We've talked about some of the stressful changes in our working environment, especially the move from office to home to hybrid working. And we've talked about how our personality makes some aspects of those change more stressful than others. What we find stressful, others might enjoy, and vice versa. What we haven't talked about is how we tend to react to stress. And that's what I'm going to look at now. And it's probably no surprise to find that our stress reaction also relates to our personality. Because for each of us, there's a core part to our personality. Part of our makeup that we tend to use most, that we trust most. Let's take that INTP, for example. Now these type preferences are something I know very well and someone I know very well because it's me. Those are my personality preferences: introversion, intuition, thinking, and perceiving. So each of us has this core part of our personality, an aspect of ourselves that we're very familiar with, that we use more than any other part of our personality. For those of you who already are familiar with the MBTI, you may know this as a dominant function. What's our favorite process? Now, I have preference for introversion. I'm an introvert. And for me, this core character is something called introverted thinking, the analyst. Given the chance, I really enjoy spending time inside my head, turning things over, thinking things through logically, and making decisions on that logical basis. I do, obviously, connect with the outside world. Arguably, I'm doing so right at this moment. But given the chance, I spend more time inside my own head. And sometimes that works well, sometimes it works less well. Sometimes, for example, because I'm thinking things through and deciding things in here, I make decisions and I forget I haven't told other people that I've made them. I assume somehow by osmosis they know my decision. My partner knows this very well, unfortunately for her, but I have, through a knowledge of type, actually become to realize this more, and I think I do this less than I used to. But most of the time, that's me at my best. But let's see what happens when stress comes along. And some of these things are things that might be particularly stressful or worrying for people with my type preferences. Thinking about the future, having too many meetings with too many external stimulation, being aware that a lot of decisions that my organisation are making, which is not the case, are illogical, having to spend lots of time supporting others, and so on. What will happen as I become stressed is I fall back on that part of myself that I know best, which for me is this introverted thinking, which means that from the outside, it looks as though I'm getting quieter and quieter. I've withdrawn into my inner world. I've gone away to my cave. If my chair was more mobile, I might physically move backwards now so you can see me going away from you. And what I'm doing inside my head is I'm tearing over the issues. I'm tearing over problems. I'm thinking things through. I'm solving problems. I'm making decisions inside my head. It's getting more and more and more and more because of wearing. I'm spending more and more of that energy inside my head. But although that's what I want to do, after a certain point, it becomes dysfunctional. I'm ignoring all the new information that's coming, which may make for better decisions. Now, because that's my favourite process, I want to keep doing that. And in times gone past, I probably would have kept doing that, and may be more likely to have got into that place of collapse and burnout. But one of the places that types be really useful for me is recognizing this reaction myself and knowing what I need to do. So if you look at that picture on the screen now, you can see the little blue T has got larger maneuver letters. I need to stop doing that and use other parts of my personality. For me in particular, what's called extraversion intuition, which really means talking to other people, engaging with people, particularly around ideas and possibilities. Now, I don't want to do that. Every part of my being is saying, go inside, solve a problem. But I know from my knowledge of type that if I pull myself out of that, I go talk to people, connect with others, that will help me pull me out of my situation, pull me out of that downward spiral, and help with the stress. Now, to help people of any type cope with one particular aspect of stress we're facing at the moment, remote and hybrid working, we produced some guidelines, and these are some of the guidelines for my type, INTP. I'm not going to go through this in detail because what we're going to do after this webinar is send you a copy of this and indeed all the guidelines for all 16 types about how to work remotely and in a hybrid way of stress. But you can see in some of those guidelines, I think some of the things that I've already talked about in terms of my stress reaction as an INTP. Let's just look briefly at someone who is very different to me. The exact opposite of me, in fact, someone who has preferences for extroversion, sensing, feeling and judging, someone who has preferences for ESFJ. This person's core character is extroverted feeling, the nurturer. You can see them there bringing presence to people. They really want people to get on with each other. They really want people to be harmonious. They really want to create harmony. The sorts of things that stress them, though, they like a degree of certainty, so about uncertainty about back in the office or not back in the office, things about health, their health, and also the health of their other people, being isolated, not having people to support them, all of those things will be particularly stressful for people with this personality type. But this person has extroversion preferences. So when they do more of their core character, more of their dominant function, their favorite process, they don't go away to their cave, they do more stuff in the world. They get louder. They become louder and more active. And what you'll see in their behavior is an exaggerated version of that creative dominance. Everybody has to get everybody else. I bring you lots of stuff. And that can be overwhelming for other people and dysfunctional for them, and actually becomes exhausting for the ESFJ themselves. And you can see there at the right-hand side that red letter F has got bigger. Now, to pull themselves out, what they need to do basically is use their sensing side, the green S, which is introverted, and stop. Pull themselves back from the situation, stop, and think quietly about practicalities, practical alternatives that might help in the stress situation. Perhaps you sit there by themselves and make a list. And that should help pull them back to a less stressful place. Now, there are guidelines like this for all of the 16 types, and those of you who are type practitioners can access these. And these, again, are some of the remote and hybrid working guidelines for ESFJs, and as you can see, they're quite different from some of the guidelines for INTPs. So let's look at what we've talked about so far. We've talked about how our working environment is changing, perhaps especially recently, and how that can lead to stress. We've talked about the things that stress out people with different personality preferences, and how what one person's stressor might actually be a motivator for others, and vice versa. I looked at some examples of that with the hybrid and remote working issues, with extraversion introversion, with survivor guilt and thinking and feeling, and with work stress in a time of change for judging and perceiving. We've looked at how people with different type preferences react to change and how that's based on that core part of their personality, which is based on all 4 letters of their type, and how our reactions to stress are also based on that core character. And we looked at how, if we know that, we can avoid the downward spiral and we can use techniques to pull ourselves away from a downward spiral and back to a better place. And we're going to actually, after this webinar, send on to you a number of additional resources that you can look at your leisure. A copy of these slides, those guidelines I talked about, and also a quick guide for dealing with stress around your personality type. And please do also have a go at a hybrid working survey if you have 10 minutes to spare. So we have time for around about an hour for today, and we hope to give some time at the end for questions. So I think we've got just around about 10 minutes or so for questions for you now. Okay? So Caitlin, what questions do we have?
Yes, thank you, John. This content has been so interesting and definitely relatable, I'm sure, for many of us. So we had a couple questions come in so far.
Okay.
If you haven't submitted any questions, feel free to do that now. We will be going through them. If we don't get to all of them, then we'll follow up with you with an answer a little bit later. But we definitely want all of your questions. So the first one that we got is actually about you, John.
Okay, interesting. That's what I get for sharing my video, I guess.
Right. How much time do you work remotely?
At the moment, 100%. That will change soon. And that's partly my choice and partly externally, partly because of external reasons. So I actually live and work in the United Kingdom, and until very recently, we were all told by the government that we had to work from home if we possibly could. So that's what I've been doing. The guidelines have just changed. The Myers-Briggs Company in the United Kingdom has just gone back to work in the office. So as of next week, I'll probably work from 1 day in the office. And actually, that's probably about right for me. That's probably right for me. I do want to connect with people occasionally, but given my type preferences, I'm actually very happy working remotely. And indeed, looking at the data from our survey every year, my type preferences of IETP, we're one of the groups who are most happy to work remotely. I do get some contact with people, my partner's around, I see my children every now and then, who are adult children, but and friends and so on. But yeah, I'm actually absolutely fine working remotely. Thank you, Caitlin. And thank you, whoever asked that question.
Okay, and so then the next one we had was, how do we coach leaders to apply the key lessons that you shared? Might be a little loaded, so if you have one maybe starting point, I know there's a couple of ways you can go with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a number of different strands in it, and I'm not going to pretend this is going to be the how to coach leaders answer, but these are some of the things, perhaps some of the strands that you might want to consider. First of all, it's clear from what we've been talking about, and it's probably going to be obvious from the outset, but a lot of the things that we've been talking about are about personality. And I think one of the key things leaders can recognize, and not all leaders recognize this truly, is that one size doesn't fit all. But putting blanket policies in place is not going to be something that works for everyone. And we've seen in some of the data that I've shown you already, and that hopefully we'll have more as we build up that hybrid survey, that people's preferences for how much they work at home, for example, is very different. And I do wonder what issues those organizations who have said everyone now go back to the office, what that will do for morale, what that will do for the productivity, actually, of those organizations. I think we've also seen in things like that survivor guilt, that people are different in how much that affects people, and that again may feel that leaders overlook things. So I think I'm sort of wandering slightly, but I think a big piece of this is about awareness. Being aware about these differences exist. Being generally aware that people with different personality preferences will find different things stressful, and it's not all about being the same as that particular leader. Now, one thing I would say is that when leaders have gone through coaching, but has used things like the Myers-Briggs type indicator as part of it, they do become much more aware of that. But in terms of specific coaching outcomes, I think that's quite a difficult question. And I'll be interested if anyone else on the call has any suggestions about how to do that. But thank you for the question, a really interesting one. And apologies, I didn't have a nice close-up answer to give you on that one.
No, that's great. So we actually, I think, had a couple that were kind of adjacent to what you're mentioning.
Okay.
I think we have one or two questions, so I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but they were I think two or three of these were asking about your suggestions with using this information, using MBTI type and knowledge of MBTI type to work with either organizations doing a lot of reorgs or role changes, and how that can be structured to, be better for introverts. And then there was another one that asked about how to make the organization making decisions about working from home better for introverts using type. So kind of like, how should they be using this type to make their decisions going forward?
Yeah. I think what I would say is that don't assume. Ask the individual, because if you assume that all introverts will never want to work from home or all extroverts will want to party all the time, you're making a big mistake. So ask the individual, but be aware that these differences will exist. Ask the individual. Think about what your organization can work with and what it can't work with. Set up guidelines so that people know what's going to happen. So you may say, for example, that it may be that you are able to say that if you can come into the office, this is the day that you should come in, ideally, because that's when everyone get together for meetings. It may be that you say that it's really good if we get together for a face-to-face meeting on this one particular occasion. So, but asking people what works for them, asking people what they want. Don't assume that everybody wants to be in the office or not everybody wants to be in office. For myself and my introversion purposes, very happy to go in once a week or so. Do want to see people, but that's enough for me. Wouldn't feel unduly stressed if it was 2 days a week. Would get a bit bored of the commute and stuff like that if I had to go in every day. So ask the individuals. Some of those things, one of those specific points on the slide, I think hopefully made sense, and we are going to send you those things after as well. I think what I see is some organizations making very blanket decisions, and you're thinking, why did you say that? Why aren't you consulting? And certainly, everybody goes back to the office. Some of those organizations may lose some very good people, not just because of people who have a introversion preference, because people have got used to the lifestyle. They've got used to not having a commute. And one of the things in one of the preliminary data from a hybrid working survey does suggest that when you ask people what's the best thing about working from home, lots of people say no commute. So there are lots of things in there. Sorry, Caitlin, have I answered the question? You may need to repeat the question.
No, I think you did answer the question. The key kind of like headline there for me was don't assume. I think that's a great kind of rule of thumb for those. Okay, and we have a lot of questions coming in actually, and some of them are pretty meaty, so we may get back to some of these via email, and we may share those answers with the group just so that everyone can hear them. But we did get another set of questions, 2 or 3 people asking something very similar about online meetings. So the question is really, do you have any guidance for facilitating online meetings that are fulfilling for multiple types? Some people were referencing that brainstorming is helpful, but then other people want less meetings. So kind of finding that happy medium.
Yeah, and I think a good rule of thumb for any organization is why are we having this meeting? And if it's so we can get together and say hello, that's fine, but make sure that you're saying that's what it is. So lots of people who want to know why we're having this meeting. I think another guideline that works well for every type is try your utmost not to have back-to-back meetings. because that's stressful, frankly, for everybody. Even people with extroversion preference, if it's meeting after meeting after meeting and no let up, at the least they're going to be a little bit stressed by it. And also those meetings are going to typically start 5 minutes late because everyone will be a bit late and it'll drag on through the day. But it's even more stressful for people with an introversion preference. So allow that time in between meetings. In terms of some specific advice for introverts, or people with an introversion preference, we did do a webcast on the power of introversion. I think it was sometime last year, I can't remember exactly when, and we did go through some of the more specific things in there, but they are things like some of the things I mentioned today. So things like, as the facilitator of that meeting, it's really important that you do your job. You don't just sit back. You make sure that no one's hogging the airtime. If someone clearly is trying to get in and has got a chance, you may say, oh, this person, did you want to contribute? You make sure that people go and jump in when introverts are just pausing for a second. Things like giving people a warning of agendas before the meeting. Not all introverts want that, but some really appreciate it. Giving people a chance to communicate back to you after the meeting. Again, do have a look at that webcast. I don't know if perhaps we could give a link to that in the information we send on to people, because that will have more about that. Okay.
Great. Okay, so we do have quite a few more questions, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through any of the answers. So I'm going to go ahead and say if we didn't answer your question, then we will try to follow up with you via email. If you have more questions, if you think of questions later, feel free to email us. You can email webinars@themyersbriggs.com, or you can email peoplefirst@themyersbriggs.com. Either of those will get you to John for answers. And as I mentioned, just to recap, we will be sending a copy of the slides and the recording out tomorrow. So you can also reply to those emails with any questions that you have. But thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you for all of these great questions that are coming through, and we will catch you on the next webinar. So have a really great week, everyone.
Thank you.